Okay, this one's going to be a little bit about like culture appropriation. Europeans are representing and wearing and practicing native indigenous way of life more than actual native indigenous people. Meaning that we from boarding schools and along the years, we don't understand that we're native indigenous. We are brainwashed to be anti-native indigenous or anti our own ethnic roots. So that's why we don't even like bother to even dwell into like the native teachings or native spiritual way of life when it comes to people who are really native indigenous who think we're Mexican. We choose not to really identify as native indigenous because through the years we are programmed to be against native indigenous like culture and native indigenous way of life. We practice more our Mexican culture rather than our actual ethnicity culture. So due to assimilation, we are practicing more our Mexican culture rather than our actual ethnicity culture. We're practicing a nationality culture more than an ethnicity culture. Since our culture got stolen, that like Europeans are representing our culture and wearing our culture more than actual native indigenous people on this Western hemisphere, and that's what causes a lot of confusion. Again, it's confusion because you see the true inhabitants of that actual culture and way of life and ethnic heritage, and you see a completely different person that looks different than people who are actually representing that culture nowadays. And it's European Americans who are more in tuned into native indigenous culture and into native indigenous way of life and wearing native indigenous things, and they normalize it to be their culture nowadays. And since the native indigenous people who think we're Mexican, we are programmed and we are now seen as representing our Mexican culture rather than our actual native indigenous heritage and our native indigenous cultures and our languages. So that's why whenever you see on the internet like native indigenous people, like native indigenous culture or native indigenous spirituality or someone playing a shamanic drum, you see a European American. You barely see like people like original inhabitants who look like the original inhabitants playing, practicing, or worshiping the actual spiritual way of life that native indigenous were doing. You barely see the original inhabitants of the person like actually who originated from. And then once you look up like native indigenous culture or native indigenous like fashion or like style, you barely see brown people. And if it was from a painting or from a very old picture. And then modern day people doing it, representing it, it's more European Americans like selling native indigenous things and practicing native indigenous ways of life and spirituality. And when it comes to like culture, the like instrument like shamanic drum and all that stuff, you see a European American either teaching you how to like the way of life or just showing you that they're more in tune into the way of life more than actual native indigenous people. So whenever I see a native indigenous person not like teaching me how back into native indigenous after decolonizing, see a European American showing me how to like decolonize from the spirituality. And that's just weird because their ancestors were the one that erased our culture. So whenever I see like a native indigenous person not teaching me like my way of life and spirituality, it's kind of weird. And whenever I see a European American like teaching me my way of life and my spirituality and like things that Native Americans or in just native indigenous history, whenever I see a European teaching me, I'm like, didn't you or your ancestors like were anti our way of life? So and then now you're teaching it back to me. In conclusion, it's Europeans are wearing it more. Like I looked on Facebook Market like and I looked up like native indigenous things. And the people selling native indigenous things were not native indigenous people. Why are people who like racially look native indigenous not selling native indigenous things? And it's not only on Facebook Market, it's just everywhere on the internet and off the internet. Like there's just like a lot of like people like who are not native indigenous or racially look native indigenous or phenotypically look native indigenous practicing the way of life or spirituality or like doing like smudging or like dressing up like a native indigenous person. They racially don't look, and I can phenotypically see if someone is not like native indigenous. Native indigenous look a certain way. Yes, they come in all colored types, but they all come in like different color types, but you can phenotypically see if someone is native indigenous. by like the way their facial structure is or the way their skin color is. And even if their skin was light or dark, you can still phenotypically see a native indigenous person. But in conclusion, European Americans, they are more in tuned and they wear and represent our native indigenous way of life, culture, and fashion more than actual native indigenous people, because we are in a facade thinking that we are Mexican still. So we dwell into our nationality culture rather than our ethnicity culture. It causes a lot of confusion when it comes to history as well and learning about history. It changes like the brainwashing of like the true inhabitants of that culture or that way of life. And yeah. And then whenever European Americans, they create a culture out of stolen culture, they are now normalized to be that culture. So yeah, and we are normalized to be a different whole other low vibrational stereotype in culture. So yeah, decolonize from all that. Decolonize back into your way of life. And spirituality, way of life, or just culture when it comes to native indigenous, it's not a native indigenous person teaching me or showing me my spirituality or way of life. It's a European American person, actually, in fact. And I just find that to be a head trip and confusion. Yeah, it makes me question and rethink the original inhabitants of that culture, fashion, language, yeah, way of life. And yeah, reclaim your native indigenous roots. And yeah, you need to reclaim all your spirituality and way of life and fashion back from the Europeans who claim to be native indigenous when they phenotypically don't really look like one. So yeah, it's always the ones with the low percentage, a high percentage of the other race, and they rather represent their lower percentage rather than what they really phenotypically look like. But I mean, hey, reclaim your native indigenous culture and your native indigenous roots if you want to, and your spirituality and your way of life. Oh yeah, and mind you, an ethnicity it's also an ethnicity culture. So the ethnicity culture should look like the original inhabitants of that actual culture. Native indigenous culture is not a nationality culture. It's not a culture that any other race can claim as much as they do. When it comes to an ethnicity culture, only that certain ethnicity can be that culture. If it wasn't, then it causes a lot of confusion and like question of that actual ethnicity culture. Because whenever European Americans are representing our culture and native indigenous culture more than we actually do, then it causes a lot of like confusion. It's like it makes you re-question history, or like, oh, I guess they were the original inhabitants and not us. We're just this other culture and they're that culture. Oh, well, we're just giving up our culture. It's not our fault because boarding schools played a big part in our ethnic erasure. So I completely understand if someone is very confused due to the fact that they're actually native indigenous. Because me, I was actually very completely confused of my own identity when it came to ethnicity. Just understand like ethnic roots, but when you understand what your actual ethnicity is, rather than just saying Mexican, because Mexican is only a nationality culture, a nationality in a country, and an area of tribes of native indigenous. Really understand what our tribe is from. It's just better to like understand what our actual ethnicity is and reclaim our way of life and fashion and spirituality back, because I don't really like to see a European American kind of teaching me my spirituality and way of life, because their ancestors tried to erase it. So I'm like a little bit like what? So your ancestors erased my culture and now you're reteaching it to me. Like, you anti my way of life? I don't know, but reclaim your native indigenous roots. Once you understand that you're actually native indigenous, you try tapping into like your actual like way of life or like fashion or like the way like your spirituality or way of life. I'm not saying be a hardcore dweller into that, but like we should start being that though. But yeah, just reclaim your native indigenous roots and culture.